And we are now live.
Hello and welcome to today's Sussex Development Lectures. Just a couple of issues to start with. We should have plenty of time today for question and answer. So please put any questions that you would like to ask in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And also to say that the closed captions facility is also available on Zoom. So I'm really pleased to welcome our speaker today, who is Professor Olufemi Taiwo, who is Professor of African Political Thought and the current chair at the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University in the United States, from where he joins us today. Welcome. His research interests include philosophy of law, social and political philosophy, Marxism, and African and Africana philosophy. He's the author of numerous books, including Legal Naturalism, a Marxist Theory of Law, which was published in 1996, How Colonialism Preempted Modernity in Africa, which won the Frantz Fanon Prize Award in 2015, and most recently, Does the United States Need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, published in 2023. Olufemi has taught widely at universities in Canada, Nigeria, Germany, South Korea, and Jamaica. And when I was looking a little bit into his philosophy, as it were, of teaching and research, what impressed me was the quote he provided, that one basic principle guides my research. Whatever I do in it must offer some new thinking about existing problems, unearth some new problems, or uncover some unknown dimensions of all problems, which I thought would be a very good rationale for us all. So the book that we're talking about in relation to today's talk was published in 2022 and is entitled Against Decolonisation, Taking African Agency Seriously. There has been a lot of praise for the book, including statements such as, it offers a bold and critical perspective on the current state on decolonization and embracing a much needed riposte to contemporary efforts to decolonize culture, language, and politics in the global south. They say, elegantly demonstrating the ignorance and violence of such aims, Taiwo inaugurates a new way of thinking about the persistence of empire is one of the great intellectual and political themes of our times. Thank you very much for coming today, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fector. And thanks, Gary, for putting this together. I would like to start by thanking Professor Alan Lester, who, on behalf of your school, originally extended to me the invitation to contribute to this lecture series. I'm grateful for his help with setting this up, his kindness to me, and I wish him the best of health. And to you, Professor and Michael Fector, for stepping in to direct these proceedings. I thank Sophie Robinson, who, from where I sit, has put together all the pieces that made this meeting a reality. Thank you, Sophie, and I appreciate your efforts to make this work. To all of you who have decided to donate your precious time to hanging out with me on this occasion, I cannot thank you enough for honoring me with your presence. I can only hope that what follows does not provoke bias remorse. Thank you for coming. What does it matter what, if any, place Africa has in the global circuit of ideas? And why should anyone be exercised by this question? Before I answer the question, let me point out that I'm not unmindful of problems that pertain to seeming to treat Africa as a unit of analysis. This is merely a pragmatic move on my part, designed nonetheless to alert us to the dangers of viewing, addressing, or studying the continent as if it were a single place marked by simple realities. I can only hope that what I say going forward underscores the complexities of life and thought on the continent. Be you an academic, a researcher, a policymaker, politician, diplomat, or a part of the global NGO bureaucracy, especially of the variety that pervades poverty pornography masked as aid appeals on television, I have no doubt that how you understand your relationship to the continent and its myriad phenomena is influenced, minimally speaking, by how you think of Africa in the global scheme of things, either through history or in the present. For instance, if you permit yourself, wittingly or unwittingly, to think of Africa as a single continuum of peoples and cultures, with more convergences than divergences in their myriad presentations, you are more than likely to affirm as similar what, on closer examination, may turn out to be very unlike, if not totally incommensurable with, one another. If, again, you think of Africa and Africans as different from other places and other humans, respectively, your take on what Africa is, what Africans are, and how you should relate to them will reflect this standpoint. The subtitle of my talk today speaks directly to these possibilities. In all what I just stated, ideas are central, and such ideas all form part of what I call the global circuit of ideas. In Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously, the book that furnishes the basis for my talk here this evening, I identified two senses of decolonization. I call them Decolonization 1 and Decolonization 2, respectively. The first refers to the process through which a place or a people that had been under colonial subjection become free of their colonial rulers and assume responsibility for directing the course of their lives under their own agency again. I argue that this is an idea of decolonization that is very easy to establish, can easily be verified, and has demonstrable consequences for the lives of the decolonized. In the literature, especially when it comes to Africa, this is what is called, derided is a better word, quote unquote, flag independence. Derided because many in the decolonizing industry, that is what it has become, and quite a thriving one, thank you, insist that this was an incomplete decolonization because the countries are still very much under the thumb of their erstwhile colonial overlords, and this is to be seen not just in the continuing control of the politics and economics of the former colonies, but more importantly, in the continuing overbearing impact of colonial ideas, practices, and processes on the culture, expansively conceived, of the nominally independent countries. This latter is what I have styled decolonization 2. On this alternative conception, in the aftermath of the original decolonization, the ex-colonized must not evince, much less embrace, elements of life and thought that are traceable to the colonizers or were part of colonial misrule while such lasted in relevant territories. This is the decolonization that I am convinced is incoherent and has no significant value when it comes to making sense of the life and times of ex-colonized, and therefore must be expurgated from our discourse. To drive this point home in my original discussion, I pose 4 questions that I suggest aspiring decolonizers should ask themselves before signing up for the decolonizing cult. And here are the 4 questions. When you are inclined to decolonize X, here are some questions to bear in mind as or before you proceed. First, is X created, caused, determined, conditioned, or influenced by colonialism? The second question is, once we have established X's credentials for decolonizing, that is, we say yes to the first question, we must identify what sort of colonialism we are seeking to rid it of. And that's because, as I argue in the book and in other works, colonialism is not a monolith, colonialism is not one. Third, when X is present in a former colony post-independence, before we rush to decolonize it as a colonial hangover or product, we must consider, and if appropriate, rule out any alternative explanations. Such explanations might include inertia or a choice by the peoples or intellectuals of this ex-colony to domesticate X in their new situation. That is, we should not be too quick to declare that the presence of X under colonialism and its persistence post-independence represent an unbroken chain of causality. Finally, number 4, given that a positive aim of decolonizing is to restore something to X that was taken away from it by its colonial origins, once we've established that there is a causal connection between X and colonialism, we might discover that in the case of an entire discipline, for example, colonial genealogy by itself means very little. Few would deny the colonial origins of anthropology. Even as many hyperventilate about, apologize for, and are scrambling to distance the discipline from its colonial roots, few efforts are being made to take seriously the ends to which African anthropologists have put it. Some of the best of them have turned this field of study to making sense of their own reality away from the gaze of disciplinary gatekeepers in cultural anthropology and urban anthropology, without needing to resort to the decolonization trope. Ironically, our decolonizers hardly ever demonstrate any knowledge of or interest in the works of these scholars. I must say that those who have tried to controvert the core claims of my book have well steered clear of taking me on this charge. Here I share the criticism of one of the leaders and probably the most clamorous voice in the industry. According to him, quote, while Taiwo has a point, please note that clause, while Taiwo has a point, his call for a total abandonment of the concept ignores the realities of continuities in discontinuities of colonialism in contemporary times. Of course, decolonization, like all other concepts, might not be adequate in explaining the myriad and multifaceted challenges of today, but it remains a relevant grammar of liberation, confronting production and reproduction of colonialities, end quote. I'm not sure that Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni realizes what a fatal concession, while Taiwo has a point, is represented in the opening clause of the quote. What makes this concession fatal is that I do not see anything to recommend in decolonizing discourse, as I indicated in my book. I have asked that we dispense with the trope altogether, not that we preserve some bit of it. If he is willing to concede that the very idea that has practically grounded his fame and principally his scholarship, quote, might not be adequate in explaining the myriad and multifaceted challenges of today, end quote, the onus lies on him to show that I am wrong in claiming that there are alternative and, I insisted in my book, better explanations for those same challenges. Beyond the identity-driven concerns of scholars like him, which I don't share, there is really not much to recommend the so-called, quote-unquote, grammar of liberation, for which he wishes to continue to massage the decolonization trope. Given that he has chosen not to respond to the complex arguments and alternative models that populate my book, especially in the matters of language, in matters of political philosophy, in matters of contemporary, transition to modernity in Africa and other parts of the world, I think I am right to look forward to more robust engagements with my arguments from others who are external to the cult of decolonization. That's what I call it. I am quite content, though, to have us remain on our parallel paths and let our respective audiences choose which path speaks better to them. I can live with that, and therein lies my challenge here today. Among other reasons that I offered in the book for dispensing entirely with the trope, one stands out for purposes of today's discussion. Once one embraces the prohibition of laying hold of any artifacts from the colonial repertoire, and the bastard periodization that turns colonialism into the singular pole for periodizing the history of the continent, one immediately settles behind a wall that makes it impossible to reach beyond it to the complexity and unbrokenness of Africa's place in the global circuit of ideas. I am convinced, as I have said in several discussions since my book came out, that what the decolonizing industry is doing in Africa at this time, when it comes to scholarship and its future, borders on the criminal. This is where the framing question for today's discussion becomes important. It is a question that exercises decolonizers no less than it does me. We differ profoundly in how to answer it. Why doesn't the world beat its path to Africa's doors when it comes to intellectual engagement, to finding African insights into the human condition beyond those compelled by pity for the prostrate condition of poor Africans, to identifying, studying, and arguing with African answers to the perennial questions of philosophy, or sociology, or political science, or theology? Why is Africa-inflected knowledge produced by African scholars, whether in Africa or in its growing new diaspora, not reckoned with, referenced, or engaged by others, both in and outside of academia the world over? I have always been concerned by the erasure of African-produced knowledges in global discourses, even those concerning Africa. In this lecture, I argue that some of the causes can be traced to some of the motivations behind the decolonization scholarship. Here is an idea of what this question entails. Aimé Césaire long ago lamented the absence of recognition of Africa's place in the global circuit of ideas, and I quote, "At the time we began to write, people could write a history of world civilization without devoting a single chapter to Africa, as if Africa had made no contributions to the world. Therefore, we affirmed that we were Negroes and that we were proud of it, and that we thought that Africa was not some sort of blank page in the history of humanity. In sum, we asserted that our Negro heritage was worthy of respect, and that this heritage was not relegated to the past, that its values were values that could still make an important contributions to the world. That is to say, universalizing living values that had not been exhausted." That was Aimé Césaire writing in 1955. Here is his colleague and collaborator, and the favorite whipping boy of our decolonizers, Leopold Sédar Senghor, speaking at the University of Cairo in 1967. I shall pause briefly at the philosophical and religious levels. We shall note, first of all, the dead Hellenic thought owes to Egyptian thought, as attested by the Greek writers themselves, the greatest of whom is Plato. In commenting on Plato, the Egyptian Plotinus merely renders Africa its due, human reason, which has found its autonomy to reach toward unity through love and the love of beauty. Without leaving Egypt, let us point out that it was in Alexandria that the foundations of the Christian conception of the world and the Trinity were cast in an African spirit. If the Romans had not destroyed the 700,000 volumes of the Alexandria library, no doubt the face of the world will have changed. But Berberland took up the torch with a pleiad of writers and thinkers, the greatest of whom was St. Augustine. Without the Africans, and especially St. Augustine, Christianity, under the influence of analytical reason, will have become, like Roman religion, a rational system of formulas and practices. It was the Bishop of Hippon who gave it its soul, its spirituality, by bringing it back to its Semitic roots, thanks to the ideas rethought and relived of charity and the creative world, both of which are African. It was St. Augustine who effected the most dynamic symbiosis of discursive reason and intuitive reason. Quote, "Believe in order to understand, and understand in order to believe," end of quote. As Arab civilization moves closer to the West, Morocco and Andalusia will continue the work of cultural emancipation and development. And then he went on to show how all this led to, the 19th century, the 18th century to Kant, from Aquinas to Kant, found inspiration in the African thought of Arab Berber authors, and first of all, from those three outstanding figures, and the three outstanding figures for him, were Plotinus, St. Augustine, and Averroes, So there, in a capsule, is the history of what we facilely but problematically call quote unquote, Western philosophy. The author fully cognizant of the many and diverse hands that had tilled its soil. Notice how Senghor wove into his description Asia, Africa, and Europe. And his account is based on very sound historical foundations. Meanwhile, when we come down to the 19th century, we had West Africa, which was, and all across our but West Africa in particular, was a hotbed of intellectual engagements, and discourses. A perusal of MJC Echeruo's Victorian Lagos and discourses of Pan-Africanism in the run-up to the inaugural conference of 1900 might show that Africa was not a mute presence in the discourses and migrating ideas of late 19th century global politics and culture. The same could be said of the perorations of scholars like Edward Wilmot Blyden, James Africanus Bill Horton, Alexander Cromwell, or George Ekem Ferguson, writing in the same period, and I'm just limiting myself to West Africa. We can find equivalents in South Africa with the new movement that Ntongela Masilela, as New Africa movement, has educated us about. How then do we make sense of how a continent that has always been, yes, has always been a presence, often a significant one in globalization, however far back we go, is only now referenced as part of European and American, or lately, Asian shenanigans in global narratives? Here is an even more pressing motivation for the current engagement. I have been working for some time on modern African political philosophy. Now that I am officially a professor of African political thought, I am concerned to introduce graduate students to a tradition of philosophizing and thinking about social and political phenomena in Africa, and have them, down the road, contributing to the secondary discourse that this discipline will need to move forward and compel attention. Because I've always believed that philosophical questions are perennial and universal, only the answers being specific and parochial, I am interested in getting my students in the graduate seminar titled Modern African Political Philosophy to see how these universal questions have been conceived and processed in the discourse of African thinkers working in Africa. Certainly, if political philosophical questions have no specific bylines and are generated only based on the complexity of the social formations and temporalities within which they arise, it will stand to reason that the annals of the discourse will reflect the global spread of their interlocutors. But I was taken aback by the severity of the absence of Africa in social and political philosophy. In fact, it became a teachable moment for me and my students. When I first taught the class, and up to now that I am teaching it again, we look at least 25 books, a mixture of text and anthologies, and only 2 or 3 included Africa in any manner, shape, or form. One anthology has 1 chapter on India and 1 on Africa. That is the standard way, And sometimes, even when Africa is included, the materials are not written by African scholars, they are written by Africanists, non-African Africanists who are working on Africa. If this were an isolated case, it would not pose a problem. But given that, as I just indicated, this is emblematic of how African contributions to discourse in which African scholars have been participants, the outcome, intended or otherwise, is the creation of a persistent impression either that Africans have nothing to say about and have contributed nothing to those discourses, or what they contributed is not worth discussing, much less engaged by others. In other words, César's lament continues to resonate in our time. Today's students, future scholars, end up with exclusions that become self-reinforcing and self-fulfilling anticipations of a, quote unquote, there's nothing to be found there mentality when it comes to African intellectual exertions. Worse still, simultaneously with these elisions, there is an unseemly focus on negative phenomena, from the consecration of corruption as the most important issue to deal with in African life, to the obsession with Africa's pathologies, as if these are not indicated in other human settings, such that generations of scholars come to think that Africa is an intellectual wasteland. The good thing is that my students no longer need to think we cry wolf when we complain about the erasure of African intellectual production. Not only that, they are also now able to decide for themselves why they think that African thinkers are not worthy of their attention. They know where to look for those neglected bits of political philosophical wisdom and or idiocy in the African ideational world. So let me skip some of this. The situation is not helped by what I call the metaphysics of difference by decolonizers and much of the African studies community when it comes to describing and explaining African phenomena. We are living in interesting times. These are times when, despite appearances to the contrary and clamorous protestations from many of us, binaries rule and ruin some of our noblest aspirations. We live in a time when binaries denominated by identity rule the roost. If you are North, you cannot be South. If you are African, you are by definition non-Western. If you subscribe to the very meaning of universal, the instantiations of which are forever asking for adequation to it, you are an easy dupe of our colonizers who, despite their plurality, are forever represented and traduced in the singular. Sadly, this discourse is more productive of heat than it is of illumination. As I have written elsewhere, affirmative answers to the question of why we should study and learn the ways of being human other than our own are necessitated by the goal of education. The need to create educated folk imbued with an expansive sense of the human experience and trained to identify unifying themes in this experience through history. The more restricted the scope covered in the educational system, the less educated its products will be. There will be too many blind spots in the knowledge of the products of such an educational system. Teachers should not be in the business if they are not committed to providing their students with as wide a range of knowledge as is available to us at any particular time. And speaking of a neglected treasure trove awaiting the questor, teacher or student, it matters little. Looking for that wide range of knowledge that is available to us right now, how about studying a thinker like Edward Wilmot Blyden and his life defined by erudition, cosmopolitanism, a near-polymath, a polyglot, and one of the most important thinkers of the 19th and early 20th centuries, period. Unfortunately, all these dimensions of a richly textured life have been panel beaten into the dull life of an opposition thinker driven by his Black identity, conditioned by, quote unquote, the African personality, his coinage, by the way, and rendered illegible to the world of ideas as a worthy influence to be cultivated by one and all in the domain of the mind. What a shame. Here is Blyden in his defense of the importance of liberal education when he was being inaugurated as the head of Liberia College, back in the late 19th century. The fear need not be entertained, and this is a quote, that a course of study in this institution will unfit men for the practical duties of life, render them proud and distant, and haughty and overbearing. Such is not the effect of a true education. I am aware that there prevails with some, and perhaps not entirely without foundation, the opinion that the effect of superior education is to inflate men and render them impracticable. This is not, however, the legitimate effect of true education. And he goes on. Every country has its peculiar circumstances and characteristics. So has Liberia. From this fact, it has often been argued that we need a peculiar kind of education, not so much colleges and high schools as other means, which are more immediately and obviously connected with our progress. But to this, we reply that, and please note, if we are part of the human family, we have the same intellectual needs that other men have, and they must be supplied by the same means. It shows a painful ignorance of history to consider the present state of things in Liberia as new and unprecedented, in such a sense as to render dispensable those most important fundamental means of improvement which other countries have enjoyed. Mind is everywhere the same, and everywhere it receives its character and formation from the same elemental principles. If it has been properly formed and has received a substantial character, it will work out its own calling, solve its own problems, achieve its own destiny. And it says, what is practical education? It is not simply preparing a person specially for one sphere of life. It aims at practical results of a more important character, at imparting not simply skill in keeping accounts, in pleading at the bar, in surveying land, in navigating a vessel, but skill in exercising the intellect accurately and readily upon any subject brought before us. The skill secured by a college education is skill in the use of the mind. End of quote. Does anyone seriously want to suggest that these ideas of glidings are of no relevance in our day or in any part of the world? But this is precisely the kind of education that we are unlikely to receive from those cathected to identity granted in the metaphysics of difference, because of course, they are looking for something African, and by definition, what Gliding just said is universal, and part of what ails them is they think that universal is owned by a particular race, and the rest of us have to find alternative ways of understanding it. No doubt, given the proclivities of the decolonizing industry, the kind of universalism that undergirds and recommends Gliding's thought can have no place in their discourse. The epithet universalist in these times is almost a four-letter word, and in our attempts to retire provincialism masquerading, often accompanied by an insufferable arrogance as universalism, we end up dissolving the very idea of the universal. That, I contend, is not merely a mistake, it is one with extremely dangerous implications for our very understanding of what it is to be human and for what binds us in that not always comfortable speciesdom that we call humanity. In trying to bring to our awareness in certain registers that have suffered unwarranted erasure, we back into an unwitting embrace of what I have in numerous writings dubbed the metaphysics of difference. And I think we should just, get rid of that. The metaphysics of difference is traceable to the constitution of Africa and Africans in the Euro-American imaginary, and now, by extension, the global imaginary that takes its cue on Africa from the West, which was enacted by Enlightenment philosophers at the dawn of modernity. Frantz Fanon knew the origin of this ugly metaphysics. According to him, and I quote, "And it is all too true that the major responsibility for this racialization of thought, or at least the way it is applied, lies with the Europeans, who have never stopped placing white culture in opposition to the other non-cultures." End of quote. Unfortunately, Africans who are mostly now graduates of colonialism-inflected education have bought into this falsehood with aplomb and will now live and die for difference. And here is Fanon again, quote, "Following the unconditional affirmation of European culture came the unconditional affirmation of African culture," end of quote, is how Fanon put the deployment of the metaphysics of difference in our discourse. But therein lies the problem. I'm convinced that this idea of the absolute alterity of the other is almost peculiar to Africa, or at least is most emblematic of the place of Africa in the global imaginary. Whoever uses difference as the metric of framing boundaries of discourse that has any aspiration to the universal immediately confronts a problem that is often unapprehended, and when apprehended, elided by all and sundry. I cannot successfully insult you if at bottom we do not share the same universe of meaning. And here, I am not even extending my purview to the art of the polite insult that requires even insiders to reach beyond the surface to catch the intended slight. Yes, you may divine, depending on whether you are inclined towards charitability or hostility, what my grimace my hand gestures, my body language are trying to tell you. Your success at making sense of them requires that something bind us, that my idioms share with yours elements of syntax, and only in this way can we fight each other meaningfully or embrace each other with anything that approaches sincerity. Here is one way to understand the problem that I'm referring to. For all those who are eager to relativize the meanings of particular terms such as modernity, universal, colonialism, and so on, their opponents like me have nothing to worry about. Only if we have a shared understanding of the meanings of the terms we use to describe our convergence or divergence are we likely to have a mutually enlightening exchange and by extension, expand the frontiers of knowledge. But when thinking is racialized such that particular ideas are attached to geographies or cultures, when what is needed is to historicize ideas in a way that allows us to see how those ideas migrate across cultural, racial, and geographical boundaries identified principally by their temporal horizons, disagreement is almost meaningless, if not impossible. Once you decide that modernity and colonialism are necessarily conjoined, and both are almost by definition Western, it is but a short distance to denying, if not dismissing, the works of African thinkers who historically have argued with, adapted, or fully embraced modernity and its core tenets, and consequently have been active participants in the evolution of all the diverse discourses of modernity from its very inception till our time. Similar considerations will apply to African contributions to the history of ideas across space and time, not to talk of all other possible boundaries. And I would like to conclude by using a specific example of how this metaphysics of difference, does not allow us to even engage the ideas that can serve the world. The second erasure that I dwell on in the rest of this discussion is that curated by our decolonizers, working under the twin binds of the metaphysics of difference and the politics of identity that together make them mostly, if not solely, interested in African ideas, and those not contaminated in any significant sense by exogenous influences, much less caused by the latter. This is what makes it difficult, if not impossible, for many of them to follow Senghor's lead above and claim Africa's rightful place in the global circuit of ideas and the motley contaminations that Africans have both enacted on others and have others imposed on them through history. This misguided search for some pristine African phenomena that can be held up as African contributions is what has issued in atavistic rehashes of practices and ideas that are best rested going forward. This is what I mean in the book of Decolonizing Discourse, erecting a wall that ends up not merely occluding what they wish to exclude, so-called Western discourses, but also discourses by Africans that cannot be traced solely to uncontaminated sources in Africans' long history. Those who think I exaggerate are invited to share with me, and I dare decolonizers to show among their ranks any serious engagement with African thinkers across the board that does not answer to their pedigree predilections or has found alien ideas to be of value in constructing their takes on what it is to be human in their domains beyond parroting the profusions of decoloniality. So let me now, I end on a debate between two of the world's most important thinkers, who also happen to be writers and Africans in the area of ethics, and who, by the way, are also interlocutors in a debate on identity that took place in the last century. Leopold Sedar Senghor and Wole Soyinka. Senghor wrote a poem titled Prayer for Peace. After an opening stanza in which Senghor laid before, quote unquote, Lord Jesus, the catalogue of Europe's violence and crimes in Africa, Senghor intoned in the opening line of the second stanza, quote, Lord God, forgive white Europe. End of quote. Soyinka, in his perorations as a humanist and a crusader for justice everywhere in the world, had to come to terms with the ethical impulse of that poem in his own struggle with the idea of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission made famous by the late Archbishop Desmond Impilo Tutu and his fellow participants in that historic event. Soyinka was troubled by the idea of the TRC in its reconciliation moment, forgiving crimes and allowing perpetrators to escape their just deserts. I don't want to hold you for much longer. While Soyinka would like to see perpetrators receive their deserts, he eventually came to see that may not always be optimal for the societies concerned and for the progress of humanity on balance. Soyinka is genuinely invested in the exigencies of the human condition, exemplified by both the descent into ignominy by the Chartering Society of a TRC and simultaneously to locate the cause of that descent and the forestalling of any future reoccurrence. Add to that the need for healing that all concerned must have if their society is to move closer to its most approbatory conception of itself. He struggles mightily with the three alternatives he identifies as possible responses by societies that are falling short of their own ideals. One, naked revenge unleashed on perpetrators of the wrongs manifested in almost mindless baying for blood by the populace, or at least its most salient segments, as happened in Ghana after the overthrow of a corrupt and brutal military regime in the 70s of the last century. Two, strike a TRC that runs the risk of allowing some of the perpetrators of the most egregious crimes to escape their just deserts. Or three, a modified TRC that expands to include both retribution and reparation. He asks, quote, how on earth does one reconcile reparations or recompense with reconciliation or remission of wrongs? There we presume that both, in their differing ways, are committed to ensuring the righting of wrongs and the triumph of justice, end of quote. Having witnessed to his chagrin the sanguinary, revenge-driven settling of scores in Ghana, Soyinka was not inclined to contemplate that as the way to go for societies that are falling short of its own ideas. Quote, in the end, one was left to wonder, in hindsight at least, if the approach of a truth and reconciliation, albeit with some fundamental changes in the essentials, something closer to truth and restitution, would not have served the Ghanaian populace better, end of quote. Despite his misgivings, Soyinka is willing to risk a TRC in the final analysis for the simple reason that either for reconciliation or even reparations, truth is a precondition. Concluding his discussion of one of the worst cases of degradation of a society, that of Uganda under Idi Amin, Soyinka contends, and I quote, the commission of inquiry that followed Idi Amin's departure has of course since revealed even more harrowing details of the last moments in the lives of Idi Amin's enemies and their resting places, if that expression may be thus misused. On that score alone, the necessity of such commissions is surely vindicated to enthrone once and for all the desirable goal of truth. Beyond truth, the very process of its exposition becomes part of the necessity, and depending on the nature of the past that it addresses, the impact it has made on the lives of the citizens, and the toll it has taken on their sense of belonging, it may be regarded as being capable of guaranteeing or foundering the future of a nation. Indeed, it may be seen as a therapy against civic alienation, end of quote. I agree with him that truth as prelude to reconciliation, that seems logical enough. But truth as the justification, as the sole exaction or condition for reconciliation, that is what constitutes a stumbling block in the South African proceedings, end of quote. How much richer will our discourses be across the globe when African scholars educate the world about the substantive engagements with the difficult questions of how we must treat one another as members of a single species, wherever the accidents of birth might have placed our origins? the decolonizing discourse on balance fails to deliver on this simple request. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm done.
Thank you very much. You have to imagine a virtual applause. I've got quite a few questions lined up here. So I just start with two which sort of target the same issue. I'll read them out one after the other. So the first is, do you distinguish between decolonization, which is indeed becoming a buzzword and oversaturated term, and decoloniality as conceptualized by Latin American scholars within the discourse of the coloniality of power? And the second version, or the related question is, thank you, my question is really on semantics. Is it useful to distinguish decolonization, in brackets definition 2, and decoloniality? And what do we gain or lose by distinguishing or not distinguishing these terms?
As I was telling Professor Fector before the start of this lecture, as a matter of principle, I do not discuss decoloniality. And the reason is very simple. I think decolonization and decoloniality are not the same things. And when people conflate them, a whole lot of confusion, arises. And the reason why I don't discuss decoloniality is, if I can make sense of what it's all about, I'll probably have something useful to say about it, but I'm unable to. And that's not a cop-out. I do read decoloniality. I do know the people who are doing it, and all that. But having said that, whatever it is that people who are doing decoloniality are talking about, as somebody coming from philosophy, the very idea of the coloniality of being is completely meaningless to me. Because if being is characterized by coloniality, how on earth are we ever going to liberate being from coloniality? And what would that look like if we were able to do so? Decolonization too, I think some people try to assimilate it to decoloniality, and when they do, yes, they can go right ahead and deal with the 4 questions that I iterated at the beginning of the talk, and see whether all the things that they say are traceable to coloniality are so. And I gave, as a philosophy person should, different standards, for this. It is one thing to say something is determined by another thing. It's a different thing to say something is influenced or conditioned by another thing. And it's a very, very different thing to say that something has caused another thing. And when we put all these, epistemic and metaphysical terms, we need clarity to actually know, which is which. Something conditioned is, less connected than something determined. Something caused means that without that prior event, the succeeding event would not have happened. So when you now take all these and you just panabit all of them into one thing, and they're all characterized by coloniality, that doesn't make any sense to me. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you for this one. I'm moving on to the next question from Alan Lester, actually. Thank you very much for your good wishes at the start, Professor Tyrell. Much appreciated, and thank you for a wonderful talk. Can I ask, do you think there is a case for decolonization as a political movement against the conflation between modernity and colonialism that is still common in former imperial metropoles, even if it is flawed as an intellectual project for Africa?
Oh, thank you very much, Alan. I'm glad that you are here. Thanks. And thanks for your question. Again, that is part of the problem, because if you are reading it from the perspective of, quote unquote, colonizers, okay, it's very easy to see how they want to claim modernity, how they want to claim the Enlightenment, as something that has been curated by a people who all look a certain way. But, you know, as I did in an essay, you know, that I did last year, when you go to the Enlightenment itself, it was not completely done by people who look a certain way. I always tell my students, Equiano and Jefferson lived in the same period. They both wrote in the same period. They both were preoccupied with the question of freedom. So why is it that people think that what Equiano wrote about freedom is unimportant and only what Jefferson wrote should exercise them? Meanwhile, when you look at Diderot, you know, and other Montesquieu, you know, and all of them, they used non-white peoples, non-white places, either as foil, as inspiration, as examples to incorporate, you know, sometimes to argue with one another, you know, within their salons, you know, in France. So what that means is that at no time can we historically correctly say that the Enlightenment was white. That's the first part. And the modernity that emerged from it, you know, if Hegel was right, and even Europe did not become aware of itself as Europe until it got to the Americas, then it means that just at a very simple level, telling the story of the emergence of modernity as something that was, you know, all done and complete in Europe will not be correct. And you don't read John Locke, you know, and his relationship to native institutions here, you know, native forms of government and so on and so forth, and how some of those made it, you know, into a treatise, you know, the treatises, and then make it seem as if, oh, John Locke was home free, all this just came to his head, you know, within the confines of Europe. So what I have done in a previous book that is titled How Colonialism Preempted Modernity in Africa is actually to argue that in the specific region of West Africa, modernity got to that place before colonialism did. And the vector of modernity in that region was Christianity. And that evangelization movement was spearheaded, for the most part, by Africans. So what that then means is that the business of inaugurating a transition to modernity in the West African sub-region in the early part of the 19th century was actually a product of native agency. So what all this does is to complicate, and that's what I'm always interested in. We should always be very, very careful with simple stories, not just single stories. Simple stories for me do not always avail. So that's my answer. I hope I did not dodge the question.
You can always have a follow-up question. I move on to another question from the chat box. I am a great admirer of Professor Taiwo's How Colonialism Preempted Modernity in Africa. I would like to ask him, what is his assessment of the decoloniality school of thought, by which I mean specifically the theoretical school originating in Latin America, spearheaded by Anibal Quijano, Walter Mignolo, and others? More specifically, what does he think of their notion of, quotes, the colonial matrix of power, a 500-year macro narrative which characterizes modernity and coloniality as two sides of the same coin? In their view, modernity, viewed from its underside, in brackets, in the formerly colonized world, is coloniality. Thus, this theory appears to deny the possibility that one can meaningfully separate the two phenomena. This has become a very influential framework in South Africa and at South African universities.
That's exactly part of what I mean by what the decolonizing industry is doing in Africa to African scholarship borders on the criminal. Because we now have young people who, for opportunistic reasons, but also for their own indolence, buy into this stuff and think that it explains everything. As far as I am concerned, let's be very clear. As I argued in my book and in other works, there is nowhere in Africa where colonialism lasted for more than 100 years. That already gives you a point of difference between Africa and Latin America. Two, in Latin America, even as colonialism pretended to have left, those who ruled Latin America were, offspring of the colonizers, who abandoned them. So if somebody wants to make a case that they embodied the continuing, colonial domination and all that, yes, that never happened in Africa. In the settler colonies, the settlers, were not, just like in other places, they were not interested in administering the Khoisan. They just wanted them out of the way. So when you are now talking about Khoisan realities, about, Tembu realities and so on and so forth, you are talking about British colonialism, but British colonialism is also, dominating of the Dutch, of the Boers, in South Africa, of Afrikaners. And as I've communicated with an Africana scholar, who has been working on this, because I asked in the book, I want to see what the decolonizing discourse looks like in Afrikaans. Because yes, the Afrikaners were also victims of British colonialism. And if you now want to use colonialism as this theoretical, pole to explain things and so on and so forth, and then you turn it into an ontological, reality, which is signaled by the idea of coloniality, then of course, we have to extend it to other places. As I said, colonialism is a human, contraption. Greece is also an ex-colony. And the opening line of the first chapter of our colonialism is, what do the following countries have in common? The United States, Canada, Australia, Nigeria, South Korea. They are all ex-colonies. So what exactly are people talking about? That's what I mean by, if you want to decolonize something, tell us which colonialism is at issue in this particular case. So when you now combine all this and then throw them all into a pot and then start talking about, modernity and colonialism not being separate, including in Latin America, all the people who pushed back against colonialism from Europe pushed back in the name of the self-same modern principles in which they have been colonized. So you are dismissing all of them as easy dupes. You are dismissing all of them as mindless, and what are you replacing them with? Some quote-unquote pre-colonial, pre-Columbian, that you have not even studied. Many of these people do not even take seriously the native people that they want to use as talking horses for their so-called theoretical flights of fancy. That's the reason I don't pay attention to it. I'm sorry.
Good, thank you. I've got a longish question. Hello, Professor Taiwo. Thank you for your lecture. Your book and your thesis or premise focuses on Africa. I offer two questions for the discussion period. One, there are nations which are former colonies of the British, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch colonizers found in other continents and parts of the world, especially Latin America and Caribbean. Through the lens of your premise, have you observed the same distortions in thinking in such nations affecting discourse among the African descent populations? The second part, additionally, there are some places and populations such as the French provinces or departments in the Caribbean, like Guadeloupe, Martinique, and French Guiana and the British Virgin Islands, which in my view may live in an odd space between an quotes traditional colony and a partially self-governing land. Is your decolonization premise being observed in any way in such lands? I may not be able to stay on for the full seminar, but thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. In fact, I'm glad that you talk about the French provinces, in the Caribbean and all that. part of what I mean by people exercising agency is how even Aimé Césaire, that Aimé Césaire, did not bother to say, we want to be independent of France. And in many parts of West Africa in the 19th century, they were not asking for independence, they were asking for the same arrangement that Canada, and remember, Canada's confederation dates back to 1867. James Africanus Houghton published his book, West African Countries and Peoples, in 1868. That's what part of what I mean by Africa's place in the global circuit of ideas. You know, does somebody want to suggest that, you know, Africanus Houghton was not thinking, or Kesley Hayford was not thinking of what was going on in Australia, what was going on in Canada, when they were asking that West Africa also be part of the Commonwealth, you know, where they will have citizenship in common with all those places, and they'll be able to run their own affairs, leaving foreign, you know, foreign affairs, you know, defense and all that to the larger British entity. So when people make those kinds of choices, why do you want, by definition, to say they must be victims of colonial mentality? That for me is unacceptable arrogance. And two, you now look, and I wrote this in the Against Decolonisation, especially when it comes to politics. You look at the West Indies, you know, the English-speaking Caribbean, precisely because after slavery, after colonialism, the only legal tender they had was modernity. They have worked it very well. They've never had coups. They're not any less Black than Africans. Many of them take their African heritage very seriously, but they run their states according to these modern principles: absolute control of civilian authority over military force, respect for the inviolate dignity of the individual. If that's colonial, so be it. But I'd rather live in a place where my inviolate dignity as an individual is not just respected, but is provided for by government. And these are all core tenets of modernity. And incidentally, all the decolonial people really want people to respect all those principles when it comes to the direction of their own lives. And I wonder where they get the inspiration from.
Thank you. I've got to follow another question. I haven't had the privilege of reading your book yet, which I look forward to doing. Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering if you could say more about the impact of the global political economy of knowledge production, in brackets, which I read as a consequence of colonialism and the making of capitalist modernity, on Africa's place in global knowledge production.
That question is answered in my book, but I will just give you, an abbreviated answer right now. Every time people complain that Western journals are imperializing them, my response is, do your own journals. If you stop feeding fresh blood to these Western journals, they are not going to have the overweening influence that they have on the direction of your knowledge production. And if you do your own journals and you give them to the world, let the world decide whether they want to buy it. That's one part of the lecture that I did not get to. If you are saying to people that they are erasing you, if your heritage is in an original language that is not available to them, you must give them a reason why they should put in the sweat equity to learn your language so that they can access your heritage.
Okay, thank you. Someone else wants to know, by focusing so much on colonialism, is there not a danger of missing elements of a much longer exploitative relationship going back to the times of slavery?
Absolutely. But we should not characterize that history only in terms of exploitation. That's the first part, you know. The second part is that we should have a very long accounting, and that's why I made the subtitle of my talk, Africa's place in the global circuit of ideas. Okay? If the Iberian Peninsula was under Moorish rule for 7 centuries, does anybody want to tell the cultural history, the political history? I do know of the Reconquista, and I refer to that in my book, you know, trying to rewrite this history. But if you are really a genuine scholar and you are interested in following the evidence and so on and so forth, can you tell the story of those places without this 7th century presence and the impact that it has left beyond buildings that are now being used just to monetize, you know, to get people to come and see, you know, the beautiful architecture? I'm talking now of ideational structures. Secondly, people always think, you know, because they believe the nonsense from Hegel about Black Africa, about Africa proper, about sub-Saharan Africa, you know, and all that, the Sahara was never, any time in history, a barrier between the North and the rest of the continent of Africa. So you are looking right there. I mean, I omitted that part in this, whatever. The monastic tradition was invented in the Sahara. Then it migrated to Ireland, and it was from Ireland that it went down to continental Europe. And then people want to tell you that, you know, Christianity is an alien religion in Africa. The Apostle Mark, you know, after the crucifixion, lived for 3 years in Alexandria. A good part of the Jewish intellectual tradition unfolded across North Africa. So you want to cut off all that and then look for some kind of, you know, Africa that was just victim of exploitation of colonialism. No, no, no. We can accommodate all these complexities. And we also must accommodate the complexities of the structures of hierarchies, of exploitation and all that within the continent among peoples who supposedly look the same in Africa. So again, I talked about internal colonialisms, you know, in Africa that were played with by various colonial authorities when they took over. If we are really serious about our scholarship, no, there are no simple answers. They don't work. And our students deserve better from us.
Yes, in the spirit of simple answers, can I just suggest people put their questions either in the question and answer box or in the web chat, which I can see. In the meanwhile, we've got Shalini Rudra, who says, thank you for your lecture. I'm a big fan of your work, a humanities and history scholar from the University of Warwick. So I just have a look.
Thank you.
Any more questions coming into either of the channels? Okay, don't.
Oh, by the way, let me just say this, you know, on the impact on the African knowledge production and so on and so forth. Yes, there is an accounting that needs to be done about how the collapse of African economies, especially in the 80s and 90s, okay, also led to the collapse of many of these sources of knowledge production, you know, journals and so on and so forth. But again, people need, and I wrote this in the book, people need to establish the causal connection between those collapses and colonialism, between those collapses and global capitalist production. Those of us who are on the ground, I have a different account of that, and I put that in the book.
Thank you. I think it's an inspiration for people to go back and have a look at the book. Just another question has popped in. Somebody would like to know whether, I will just read it out. It is not clear to me whether the prof is saying decolonial theory and decolonization must be abandoned?
As I said, I refrain from the fate of decolonial theory, but decolonization trope, we should get rid of it yesterday. Whatever it is doing, some of us had been doing before it became faddish without us calling it decolonizing. And as I said, if we can have alternative explanations, then decolonizers have to show us why their trope offers us a better handle on things. And I find it coming up short every time. Let me again share with the audience, I published a paper titled On Diversifying the Philosophy Curriculum in 1993. There was no decolonizing then.
Thank you for the reminder of the time depth of the discussion. Can I please ask a final round of questions? Anybody who hasn't put this, yes, hang on. There is one. Okay. Follow-up question. The fact that it was being done before doesn't mean we cannot provide a new label, surely.
I'm sorry?
And the fact that the same person follows up saying the fact that it was being done before doesn't mean we cannot provide a new label, surely.
Oh, no, I don't have any problem with that. If we come down to labels, sign me on. But I thought that decolonizers would love to be taken more seriously than just being, labels.
Yes, that's true. Thank you very much. So if there are no more questions, I can't see any just right now. Oh, no, hang on. Popping in. Okay. Final riposte. Mignolo, in Epistemic Disobedience, admits that the ideas on decolonization and the theory aren't original or new.
I'm sorry?
Mignolo, in Epistemic Disobedience, admits that the ideas of decolonization and theory aren't original or new.
Okay, so I guess I got something right for them. I'll take it. But that's not my main point. My main point is that it doesn't deliver the goods when it comes to enabling us to understand, explain phenomena. And that is what a good theory should do.
Yes. Yeah, and then I'm going to close this thread saying they are being furthered and I don't think you should dismiss them. So I think we've probably exhausted this line of inquiry. If there's anybody else, one final opportunity. But otherwise, it is left to me to really thank Professor Olufemi Taiwo. It's been a great pleasure to have you and to hear you engage with all these questions from everywhere. I should say that the recording of this lecture will be available on the IDS website, and it will be emailed to all those who registered, which is actually more than were in the room today. So please share with your colleagues who couldn't attend today. I should also say that this is the final Sussex Development Lecture for this academic year, and all 6 lectures are available to watch on the IDS website. I should also say that the Department of International Development here at Sussex will be active in shaping next year's series. So can I please ask people who are related to Sussex or anybody else, send us suggestions of who they would like to hear speak. As we've seen today, this is a fascinating array of ideas and dialogue that we're happy to engage in. So thank you very much again for coming today. And I hope to see you again in the next series. Goodbye.
Thank you all very much. I'm very grateful, and thanks for coming. And thanks, Professor Fector. It's nice meeting you. And thanks, Gary and Professor Lester. All the best to all of you. Thanks.
Thanks.